Good evening, everybody. It's Chelsea Ohlemiller, and tonight with my Grief and Goodbye series, I have a super awesome guest who has been extremely flexible with the power outages and just connecting. We've had some difficulties getting together, and so I would love to welcome Mandy Capehart. She is an author, podcast host. She's the founder of the Restorative Grief Project. She is the author of this amazing book, which is actually a memoir / 31-day guide for grieving individuals, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But I would just love to welcome Mandy. How are you?
Hi, Chelsea. Thanks for having me. I'm doing pretty well, all things considered.
Yeah. Well, so I want to first let everybody know that all of Mandy's social media accounts will be put in the comments so you can follow her really quickly. The link to her book will be in the comments section as well. Her website, which is a wonderful place for resources, her podcast, things that she's been involved with. And so all of that will be in the comment section when we're done tonight. And anytime that you guys have questions or things you want to ask Mandy, things you want Mandy to talk about, make sure to put those in the comment section so that we can talk about those this evening. So welcome, and tell us a little bit about your story, what led to your book and your journey, for those that may not know.
Long story. Okay, so yeah, I have been a writer my whole life, and I don't know if there's been a day since probably I was 5 years old that someone in my story has made it. Like someone has passed away almost consistently since I was a little girl. And whether they were friends of the family or family members, it's always been something very on the front of my mind. As I got older and recognized this is something I can't quite avoid, I started digging into just what it means to be vulnerable with your story, to start telling your story in a way that really gives you an opportunity to be honest with it rather than trying to make it fit the narrative that you think it should or make sense to someone else. Finding a way to make your story make sense for you. And so it was about 5 years ago now that my mom passed away, and that came out of nowhere. It was on the heels of losing my grandfather, my great grandmother, um, years of infertility in my own life, and I decided that I couldn't survive if I didn't make a very active choice, because losing your mom, as you know, is pretty foundationally terrible. And I had a great relationship with my mom, but I took about a week after she passed away and decided I'm going to be okay, just coping, just skating through whatever I need to do to survive this week. I'm going to do it. And then on day 7, I said, okay, I have a choice. I can continue down this path, or I can continue down another path that leads me into some really hard things, but that will leave me reckoning with my story and with my understanding of grief in a way that hopefully moves the needle for other people in addition to me. So that was where I decided I'm going to really be intentional. I started speaking publicly about my grief, about my mom, and just about the impact of what was going on in my family and in my faith through this loss. And what I found was the church had no space for me. I've been a worship leader for 16 years at this point, although I've stepped down now. I've been in the church since I was little. And although I'm not one to necessarily conform to a space that I'm in, I still would walk into rooms and say, this is something I'm handling. This grief is still heavy for me. And people wouldn't know what to do with me. And I was really frustrated because it didn't matter how long it had taken for me to get to that point. I was hurting and no one knew what to do. So I decided, fast forward to the pandemic, on the day that we were announced our schools are closing, you're all staying home for the rest of your lives, it feels like. And at the time, of course, what did we know? We didn't know when it would end. I realized we're about to enter into a global, unacknowledged grief pandemic on top of everything else. That was actually the moment I decided I have to write something. I don't know what it's going to be. I've been trying to figure out what a book would be for years, and this one came out of me very quickly. And although it's not the book I wanted to ever write, it's one that has proven to be the book I needed, because I was able to create a space for me to heal and also to bring others in. But it also turned out to be something incredibly necessary for our culture right now, just in the immediate sense of my personal culture, but even on the grand sense of everyone else. So the book became a mentoring and coaching project. It's become a podcast. It's become a bridge between myself and some incredible new people like yourself that I'm meeting
Yeah.
all over the world that have just realized, yes, this is an incredibly necessary conversation. And I believe we owe it to our children to be the grief literate community and generation that we didn't have.
Absolutely. And I love that you brought up in, your storytelling that, there is such this sometimes disconnect between faith and our safe spaces that we think are there, in our spiritual world and our faith world, with what we believe as Christians
Mhm.
or whoever, and then this pain that we feel. And you kind of talk
Yeah.
about that in your book, and you say, there was this space to honor the life, but nobody knew how to hold my grief and how to help me hold my grief. And I was, it was such a vulnerable thing that you talk about, because you would
Mm.
think, or a lot of people think that, oh, the safe space is always my church, but that's not always the case. And I think we're at our most vulnerable and raw selves when we're dealing with a significant loss. And I love the way that your book acknowledges some of the spaces that aren't necessarily equipped always, and how eventually they become equipped, or how you learn to deal with it in different ways. And so that is one thing that I really liked about your book. And I also think that through the collaboration of a memoir and also a
Mm.
guidebook, it's something that is, it gives people tools, and also you're using your own experience to provide such deep empathy and understanding. And I think that that's
Mm.
just such an incredible thing that your book has to offer grieving hearts. That's something I took away from it. And
Mm.
so I'm going to show everybody again, because it's just such a beautiful book. And I didn't expect to show it this early, but just from what she said, it's just, she does talk a lot about faith, and not only the parts that were, positive and beneficial and understanding grief, but also the spaces, like I said, that there were some holes and people
Yeah.
that didn't know how to, hold you in that pain, in that space.
I
So,
think what's really interesting about, and what I learned about my own faith community too, and my own faith even, is recognizing most people are not setting out to try and damage or add additional pressure or injury to our grief process. They simply don't know what they don't know. And so,
absolutely.
especially in the faith realm, right? Scriptures are almost predisposed to becoming platitudes, because when you're hurting, some of the scriptures feel like knives under your skin. As much as you trust, as much as you believe them, in that moment, it feels like everything has been unraveled. And that's actually a really safe, okay place to be. But what I experienced was a number of people just asking, "So when are you coming back?" And I'm like, "I don't know if I am." Not that my faith has changed, but listen, I can't be honest here. I need to be in control of my big emotions, and I need to know that it's okay that my unanswerable questions don't have answers. And in the faith space, not just the church I attend, certainly the grander scheme, those aren't tolerable situations. We can't have a lot of people just cannot tolerate unanswerable questions or
Yep.
being quiet at my consistent pushback and statements that I would make about grief, just to test people, just to see where they were at, in the sense of, can you hold my big questions? Can you
Mm-hmm.
recognize that I'm going to be very angry, but I can move through it if I have safety?
Yep.
I can move through the anger to a point where I can actually ask questions and recognize, well, this anger is secondary. It's hiding something else that I'm not ready to feel. And that's actually also a very intentional thing. So, this book became a tool that I use consistently for myself. I was joking with someone the other day and said, I know I wrote the book and I'm so glad people like it, but I would have written it for me, because it put so many things that brought me back into alignment throughout my grief story in this book, that it's become just an easy reference of, wait a minute, checking in with myself, what's out of alignment. Okay, in my head, I already know where the things are in the book. So I can go to that one tool and bring myself this sense of peace, and just remember, right, this is not a book to fix things, because there's nothing to fix, but
Yep.
are things to bring back into alignment.
Absolutely. And there's a couple of questions, and we'll get to those in just one second. And I want to say hi to Fiona because she was here last night too. So, but what I also love is that before your book, I have seen other grieving, not guides necessarily, but that are like October 1st, October 2nd, that are very specific in their days. And this 31-day like journey is not like that. And I loved it because it was just day 1, day 2,
Yeah.
and sometimes I had to stay on day 4, like
Yes.
I'm still
Yes.
at day 4, and I did that for a couple days, and would reread that and kind of make notes. I like to write and, make notes about it. And so I really enjoyed that about your book, is that, while it is, 31 days, it's your 31 days, whatever that looks like. And so I think that was a really awesome way to, complete the book and to organize it. But I want to ask you, so Fiona says, did you ever lose faith at times? And if so, how do you get back to having it? So I'll let you answer that. And I know I lost faith a lot. I lost faith right away, I think, for me. And it took a while for me to get back to my faith. And I realized that kind of I was raised Catholic, and my mom was raised Catholic, and her mom was raised Catholic. And for me, I ended up realizing that it wasn't, tradition no longer suited me. And I had to find something else that worked. And so I did eventually. We have a new faith community that we really enjoy, and it uplifts me. But like Mandy explained earlier, there are still some unanswerable questions that I have. But I know that on Sundays when I enter this space, it helps me feel inspired. But I did leave the church for a very long time, and I got mad with God and left, and was very, and I even wrote a post once that said, I forgive you, God. And people were like, who are you to forgive God? But I'm like, this is how I am right now.
Hey.
This is my grief journey.
Yes.
To get through it, I had to say, I forgave God, for taking my mother at a young age. So I don't know, Mandy, did you lose, how do you want to answer that?
It's a great question because it's so nuanced. It's so individual. And I totally lost faith. Like I said earlier, that 7 days after my mom passed, my family and I all flew to where she was. And after she died, my aunt, her sister, and I are really the very practical, let's just get it done people. So for 7 days, we were all in town, practically getting things done and trying to navigate the emotion of it, but also the nature of, we have a short period of time to handle a lot of things, and we have to lock this down. It was on day 7 that I said, all right, Lord, I'm either all in or I'm all out, because this doesn't make sense to me. I don't think I have the emotional capacity to do the spiraling that I want to do and survive it. I'm also someone who is very capable of detaching from my emotions. I can pretty easily step back and take a very logical look at them. And I think the same is true of my faith. I've been able to take a step back and say, not that I'm trying to logically make sense of miracles and a lack of miracles, but in the sense of, I don't need to understand this to trust it. I can reckon with my own lack of trust in the miracles of God to show up and revive my mother, right? I can still believe that he is good, but I have to figure that out on my own. And so for me,
Oh, yes.
what would happen for me is I would start approaching my faith in a way that said, I'm going to go back to basics and say, I believe nothing. I know nothing. And the more I say that, the more confident I become in the mystery of it all. I don't think that God takes people from us. I think that's a very easy conclusion to come to if you read scriptures literally, or if you believe a faith that is very practical and transactional. It makes sense to think that, oh, they died and it was a punitive response. Or someone once said to me, that person was holding me back from my destiny. And now that they've been removed, whether it was intentional or not, like, now I can reach my destiny. And I just thought, but that was your spouse, that was your child, that was your parent. Like, that's not how faith works. And I only can say that with confidence because that's not the nature of the heart of God. If I stand back and say, I understand the heart of God to be full of compassion, undeniably merciful, unbelievably graceful toward me and anyone else, then everything that I believe is happening has to align with that character. That's my interpretation of faith. And
Yeah,
so
no,
when
that's a
I
great way to describe that. I think that's a great way to describe that.
Well, and
Absolutely.
that's what helped a lot with it, faith traditions too, right? And same thing with any kind of traditions. I recognize, like, if I'm doing these things and they're bringing me pain, I can sit back and wrestle with them and decide this is something worth keeping. This is something worth holding on to. The same is true of my faith. I shredded it to pieces. This is going to sound super bizarre. I had a lot of fun pulling apart my belief systems and deciding, well, where did this belief come from? Where did this conclusion show up in my story? And when did I start believing it? And is it true? Can I hold this up to his character and say, yeah, unequivocally, I believe that that is true? And there were a lot of things that stripped away. So for me, this book became a place where I had the absolute grace to offer others as well who were doing the same thing and say, you're going to come to different conclusions than I will,
Yep.
big time, because you're not me. And even people I agree with, I don't agree with fully. That's
Yep.
normal. That's natural. So I think, to answer your question, the reckoning and the willingness to strip it all down is what really brought my faith back to me. I made it personal. It became something I could hold on to. And even recently, I was just returned to church again for the first time in almost 2 years after this pandemic. And I was sitting at the front row with my friends preaching about grief from the pulpit, and I was so honored. It's a longer story, but I really felt the Lord say, it's time to grieve what you haven't grieved about your faith. What about your faith specifically haven't you grieved in the last year? And it was something where years ago that would have probably wrecked me. In this season, because of the work I've been doing intentionally and trying to show up and pressing into uncomfortable places, it was a relief. I was so grateful. I had happened to have my journal that day with me, and I just sat and thought, yeah, what am I grieving here? What am I missing? What needs attention? Because grief is it's just our hearts and our minds and our bodies recognizing, hey, I'm out of alignment, and stirring something up so we can pay attention.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, to answer it also, I think a lot of
Mm.
times people don't realize how common it is. A lot of people are like, is this normal? I'm like, I don't know what normal is, but I can
Yeah,
tell you
what's
it's
normal?
common. And
Hmm.
I know that so many people that I've talked to that have experienced significant loss go through a period where their faith is very, shaken and
Yeah.
it's here, there, everywhere. And so I think it's definitely a common theme that I've seen with grieving people. So I
Yeah.
hope that helps, Fiona. Um, I'm gonna look through here. Let's see.
Hi,
Um,
Chloe.
yeah, Chloe said awesome things about your book. So if
She's a
anybody's
Twitter
wanting
friend.
if anybody wants to hear a firsthand review, Chloe posted one. Hey, Pat was here last night too. Melissa says, I'm Melissa.
Mm,
I lost my mom to suicide at 17, now
mm,
24. Just found you guys. The holidays are so tough, and I'm so happy I found a page like this. Oh, that's so sweet. And we can actually talk about that a little bit. I
mhm.
don't know. I know you do a lot in the grief, in grief work and healing. So what are some things that think are helpful or encouraging around the holidays for people that are grieving? Because that's such a common
Mm,
theme and
mhm.
question that I get. And so I don't know if you want to touch on that a little bit, Mandy.
Yeah. So a couple of friends of mine and I actually have a live clubhouse chat planned around this topic and grief in the holidays and how to navigate. We don't have a date set, but it is absolutely one of the hardest things. We don't see it coming because we think holidays, yay, happy celebration. And then you have those moments where all of a sudden, oh, but my person's missing. And I was looking forward to Christmas because mom always makes, the pies, and those won't be there. You have these little micro griefs that come up when the holidays enter the scene. And one of the things that I have done is to simplify. I
Mhm.
actually give myself utter permission to cancel all and everything starting in October. Uh, that includes throwing parties, that includes attending things. I have been very clear about boundaries when it comes to the holidays, simply because we have so many expectations as it is on our
Mhm.
lives. And I don't want to add more when I know my capacity is lower. When I have a tendency to feel like, okay, I can celebrate here, but I want to be with people who are safe so that if I decide in the middle of whatever costume party I'm at or like ugly sweater Christmas party, right?
Mm.
That I can just say, oh, this is too much. I need to leave and be completely free to do that. And if there's people in my story that I interact with at the holidays that I'm not safe to do that with, they're not in my story at the holidays. Uh, so that's one, giving
Yeah,
yourself that
boundaries
space
is
to
that's
simplify
a
and put boundaries in there. Yeah.
yeah.
And the other is reframing our traditions. So we have a lot of traditions in our family that have come and gone over the years. They're always around food because my mom was a chef, my grandmother's a great cook, my aunt's a great, everyone's a great cook, my dad. And we used to have the biggest holiday celebrations when we were kids. All the families would come together, and then after deaths and divorce and the spreading of people to different parts of the cities and the countries, it just it lessened. Our ability to connect with each other at the holidays lessened. And when I recognized, like, that was a source of grief too, losing those other traditions, but that doesn't mean that I can't have similar traditions that harken back to that or to reframe something. And so that's something else we've been doing is as our core little family, my husband and my daughter and I, or even including different people in it, we've been actually just forming our own traditions in a way that honors the people that we've
Mhm.
lost or the people that can't be with us. And recognizing that, yeah, it's always going to be emotional. It's always going to hurt. There's never going to be a time that this doesn't bother me that my mom is not present. However, my grief and the story I tell myself about my grief is only going to make sense if I take time to understand it differently and allow myself to expand around it. So I'm definitely the person that believes as we gain more understanding and self awareness and just capacity to handle really complex things, again, without trying to find answers or judging ourselves or shooting on ourselves or shaming ourselves for grieving or even introducing the word still. I'm still grieving. Of course, you're still grieving. If it mattered, you have to let it matter, and it probably will matter your whole life. So when it comes to the holidays, I simply offer myself the ability to be tear streaked face while I'm cooking beef bourguignon in the kitchen in honor of my mom, right?
Yep.
Or we did New Year's Eve, I think this last year, we did a big seafood platter. My whole family does not love seafood, but they were willing to do it because I said, you know what? I really need to honor my mom this New Year's Eve. Something is just in my guts. We're going to do this. And it created a new tradition. And that said, I am one that I can handle changing traditions. I realize that that's kind of a paradox, but grief is a paradox. And I think that the more we
Absolutely.
recognize that and admit that even faith is a paradox, all of these things, like there's no clean lines between A and B, no matter how much we wish there were. So
Yeah.
it's the same as with the holidays and celebrating.
Yeah, and I think that I'm so glad that you brought up the traditions because I am one that I was not okay with, grief
Mm,
comes and it just shatters so many things. And one of them is the family composition and who
mhm,
is the head of the family and who's the
mhm,
organizer and all of these things. And I really struggled with that because my mom was everything. She was the rock, she was the organizer,
yeah,
she was everything. And so for me, for those first couple of years, I worked so hard to continue the traditions that it was actually more harmful for me. And I didn't realize it
mm,
until my husband said, honey, like you are working so hard to keep these traditions. And I said, well, I have
yeah,
to. Like my mom isn't here, so we have to keep them. And he said, but what is it about those traditions that you loved? It's that your
right,
mom was there and she was present and
right,
she was doing all these things and it was the same every year. And he said, if it's more work to continue the tradition and it's actually, you know, more painful than happy, then maybe we should redo our traditions and,
right,
create new ones that our children ultimately will remember and love. And
yeah,
once I gave that up and thought, okay, the pressure, my mom would never want me to continue these things if it's stress and not, success. And so I had
mm,
to really rework that in my brain. And once I did, of course, the pain of my mom not being in anything, whether it's new or old, is still there. But it did alleviate some of that stress and pressure that I was
mm,
putting on myself. And so I think sometimes, what you don't want to, but sometimes just shifting those transitions or making some tweaks can really provide
mhm,
you the space to grieve differently and continue joyful things in a new way. And
Mm.
so I think all
Yeah.
of those things are really important.
It's interesting when you think about, well, what would my mom say if I were here and crying into this soup that is her soup and I wish she was here to make it? What would she be saying to me right now? And I struggle a little bit with the idea of like, well, they wouldn't want me to be sad. Of course they wouldn't. That's
Right.
how, that's what attentive parents are constantly trying to do, right? Mitigate our mistakes, our injuries. You're fine.
Yep.
You can't, you're right. Teach us before we learn the hard way, all those things. And it's funny because someone said that to me not too long ago. They checked in on me and said, "Oh, how are you doing?" And I said, "Honestly, it's a hard week. This is the week of my mom's birthday. I'm struggling today. This is hard." Her response was, "Well, honey, your mom wouldn't want you to be sad." And I pushed back and said, "Actually, my mom would want me to be honest. And
Oh, yes.
honesty right now is there's a lot of pain in my heart that I need to sit with and let myself feel. It's not forever. All of these, whatever it is, the chemical adrenaline floods that are causing anxiety in me, just the utter revelation that I will never see my mom on this earth again, whatever it is that's come up that's triggered me, I know my mom would want me to be honest. And if I didn't have a good relationship with my mom when I lost her, I still believe that I would owe her and myself my honesty, even in those moments. Because when, in my mind, someone, and this comes up a lot in my coaching practice too, but when someone says, well, I think that they would say, these people offer me platitudes like trying to encourage me, they wouldn't want you to be sad. I feel like that's just an admission, a projection of that person saying, well, I don't want you to be sad. I need you to be happy right now.
Yeah.
I'd love to check in on you, but the fact that you're hurting makes me feel out of control.
Yeah.
Not that I can control you, but I guess in my head, maybe I think I can control you. That
Yeah.
inner narrative, right? I just kind of make some assumptions, but it's proven itself to be true more often than not. So when I hear those things, I say along the lines of, well, I'm going to be honest. I am out of my comfort zone right now, but it's okay if you can't be here with me. I don't
Right.
expect you to hold space for me if it's not something you can handle right now. And there's no judgment from me if you can't handle it. And even if it's family, even if it's, I mean, the number of times I've let my husband off the hook, I've lost count because he deserves that same level of permission to just step back and let me have space or, to approach with caution when he's ready and available to me too. But
Yeah,
anyway,
and I think you
tangent.
mentioned, and you may not even realize
Yeah.
that you did this, but one of the other things that I always encourage non-grievers to do is to check in on the people. Even if, your friend lost
Mm.
her mother 3 years ago, check in with her the
Yeah.
weeks leading up to the holidays and just say, "Hey, how are you? And I really wanna know, like, tell me how your heart is
Yeah.
today. Do you wanna talk? Do you want a coffee?" I would encourage everybody that knows somebody, even if you're a grieving person, if you know somebody else, that's lost anybody that's significant in their life, a
Mhm.
mother, a father, a grandparent, anybody that meant something to them, check in on them because we are the worst at advocating for ourselves, I think, because our pain
Yeah.
does make people uncomfortable. But I will tell
Yeah.
you, I remember every time that a friend or an acquaintance has messaged
Mhm.
me or checked in and said, "Hey, I just thought of you today because I know that the holidays
Yeah.
are hard." And just that helped provide some light and some encouragement. So I would encourage
Yeah.
everybody to do that around the holidays for each other even.
I have a friend who is so intentional, and she, every couple of weeks, will just post on social media, "Hey, if you are grieving a loss, would you privately, if you're comfortable, I would love to pray for you on that day. If you could privately reach out to me with your person's name and the date that I can be covering you with prayer, please do so." And she faithfully, she's like, "Oh, the other day she said, I didn't have anyone for that date and I got someone finally." And I'm like, God, your hopefulness, your excitement to cover people and to show up for them is beautiful, because there's another side of that too, where grievers who finally do know how to articulate what they need have to recognize, I also get to say what I don't need. And if she were to reach out to me on that day and say, I just want to know genuinely how you're doing, I know that she's someone I've given permission to come into that space, right? To come in
Yep.
and come close and have my details. But one thing I teach everybody I talk to who is grieving is you don't owe your story to anyone. So when people
Absolutely.
show up, and this was big in the church too, and which is why I just started pushing back and saying like, nope, not interested in anybody's support because it's going to come in and I'm just going to get rage filled and say, you don't understand that you're hurting me by trying to help me and you're not listening.
Mhm.
Was just recognizing I have permission to decline to offer details. I have permission to decline services. The other day, someone passed away from COVID, and the gut response was, "Oh, were they vaccinated?" And I pushed back immediately and said, "Fully irrelevant. Also, not your. You don't need to know any of that."
Right.
Oh, well, did they have subsequent? Did they have other health issues? Again, not your story. You don't deserve access to someone else.
Yep.
If someone, anyway, all of that to say, I think that being able to support grievers and come alongside them is absolutely crucial. But as grief supporters too, while we're checking ourselves for platitudes and making sure we don't, inadvertently wound further, recognizing people are going to reject our help and it's typically not about us. In fact, 99.9% of what that person is going through has nothing to do with us. So offering that compassionate support is so beautiful as long as we recognize if it's rejected, that person is probably either doing okay, has their circle set, has their boundaries, has their people that they need around them, and has resources that they don't need from me. There's nothing wrong with saying, "Oh, I want you to know I have this." I've had so many people that are like, "I'm going to buy this book and give it to all these people that I know." I'm like, "Hey, actually, I'm going to encourage you, buy it if you want, offer it to them as an option when they're ready. Don't mail my book to someone. It's super presumptuous." I realize it's like a gift and that sounds weird, but there were a lot of times, especially because it's all about there is my faith interwoven. And I know that is a huge source of grief for people as well. I said, let people that you love know you have this resource, you know the author, and you would love to chat with them about it when they're ready. Or otherwise, just keep it to yourself and wait till they ask, because I just would hate to be the source of someone else's furthering in their wounds because they were thrust this book upon them, and
Yeah.
then they say, well,
Or
that
just
was
show up
yours.
with the book with a Post-it on it that says, "When you're
Yeah,
ready," just
when
like
you're
anything
ready.
else.
Yeah.
Like when
Yep.
you give some pizza or muffins, they're gonna eat it when they're ready.
Yeah.
Just take the
Yeah.
book and use it when you're ready.
Yeah.
Because they will be ready. It's a book that definitely,
Mm.
provides that comfort and just somebody else, that when you read it, you're like, "Oh, she gets this." Like, you
Mhm.
know, somebody that's been there that can offer advice and inspiration because you've walked that path.
Yeah.
So, but let me look
Thank you.
through a couple of more. I know
Mm.
somebody said that they really struggle with grief at night, and I was the same
Oh,
way.
yeah.
Nighttime was extremely difficult for me.
Yeah. Well, nighttime is so challenging because your brain is, you have total decision fatigue. You've been making big or little decisions all day long. So by the end of the day, sometimes the decision to wash your face is a hard one. So your guard is down. Your guardian is tired and needs a break. And then your brain is trying to transfer all of your short-term memories and what happened during the day into long-term memory. But it's also trying to just restore what is there. And when you have things that are unacknowledged or you're processing through grief during the day, it's going to manifest. Just like if we watch scary movies during the day, we're going to have scarier thoughts in our dreams. Our brain is trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. I had a lot. I still occasionally will struggle with insomnia, um, but especially when my mom, right after she died, I think in the 2 or 3 years after she died, I would just sit straight up and say, "Well, I'm wide awake, okay." And I found some coping tools. I would make sure it was cool enough and I wasn't like super hot, and I would just listen to old reruns of a show, just listening, not watching, but like listening to it just to give my brain a different narrative as I was falling asleep. I even recently started re listening to older books that I've already read, like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and Chronicles of Narnia at
Yeah.
night with a timer, just so it would turn itself off. But I could fall asleep with something else as the last thing I'm thinking about. Because otherwise, you hit the pillow and your brain immediately says, cool, you have no distractions now. I'm going to
Yes.
go through all the things I've wanted you to overthink about all day that you've somehow stayed busy and avoided. And one of the other things that I really appreciated was having a friend offer to be the person I could call in the middle of the night,
Oh,
to be
that's
the
great
person that
advice.
said, yeah, that I, if I'm having a panic attack or if I'm feeling just wide awake and nothing is helping me fall back to sleep, uh, I had someone that I could call, that I could actually, and I'm being me, I would text and be like, hey, are you awake? And I would always get back
Right.
a, obviously I said I would be awake. So, ring. Um, but it was knowing that little piece of it was like, I'm not alone. We know we're not alone in insomnia. We know we're not the only people grieving, but our stories are unique to us. And so if we don't step out of our little bitty comfort zones, I mean, grief shoves us right out of them. So we may as well just, all right, form a dive position instead of belly flopping, right?
Yeah,
lean
exactly.
lean into the fall. Having those resources around you when you need them is crucial. There was one night that, like I said, I go back to my own book. There was one night that I woke up like unable to really, I could breathe, but I felt like, God, this is really hard. I need to come back into my breath. And I just suddenly thought, oh, I have something like this that I know, that I know, that I know, that I know brings me back down to a baseline. I'm going to go get that and just sit alone instead of trying to take medication to fall asleep or do 100 other things or just choosing to stay up. Sometimes I would do that out of like this weird, well, fine, insomnia. If you want me awake, then I'll stay awake. Just that
Yeah.
inner rebellion. But anyway,
Yeah,
I would sit. Go
I
ahead.
think that, I agree is that, for me, it wasn't the insomnia necessarily, but it was like I had to learn to nighttime was awful. I was having
Yeah,
anxiety, I was having panic attacks, and I knew that, at first I did have to go to a counselor and say, "Look, I need help with this." And I did
yeah,
have medicine, but I had to get to the point where I was like, "Okay, it is bigger than this. Like I have to figure this
right.
out." So you're exactly right in that it was this busyness. So I realized, okay,
Mhm,
when it's dark and still and quiet, my grief overwhelms me. And so I
mm,
have to learn to sit in all of
mhm,
those things. I have to learn to
mhm,
sit in the dark. I have to learn to sit in the quiet. I have to learn to sit in the still moments because they're always going to be there. Like there's
right.
always going to be night. There's always going to be a time when it's quiet. There's always going to be a time when it's still. And so
Yep.
I got to learn how to do this. And it took me a long time. And just like you, I think I used the Calm app for a while.
Mhm,
That worked for a while, then it didn't work anymore. And
right.
then, I just had to keep figuring out what worked for me. I listened to actually, that's how, when my mom passed away, I'd never seen an episode of The Office and I needed funny. I found out
Yep.
that humor helped me. So I would
Yeah,
watch every funny episode. I watched the entire
yeah,
seasons of The Office,
yeah,
and I think that, really it's so unique for each person. I think night is a common hard time for grieving hearts. But I also think that each person has just got to figure out what you can do to cope with those things, the still and the quiet and those things.
yeah. It can be really difficult because medication is powerful, but it's a Band-Aid on a bullet wound at that
Yeah.
point. And
Oh yes.
especially if there's trauma involved in the loss, that can make it 10 times harder. It's easy for me. My mom died from cancer to say, oh, I've learned to lean into the hard things. I've learned to sit and be still and look at my grief with a curious heart and not judging myself and to become mindful of it. But when a traumatic loss is what's being stirred up, it's not just the loss itself that you're sitting with. It's so many other pieces of your identity that are touched that feel unstable. One of my best friends, lost her husband almost 9 years ago now, and to a brain tumor. And their little kids are now teenagers. And it has been a fight for her every day, every month, every year to remain in a place where she can actually even look at her grief and feel some semblance of a settling. So even with her, like I would never look at her story and say, well, if you just sit with it, it'll get better. Actually, there's other ways to sit with your grief in a way that addresses the trauma and addresses the loss. That's not you just trying to muscle through it. Cause that's one thing too. I
Yes.
did the same with humor. I was listening to Brooklyn Nine-Nine. I think I've watched the show like 10 times through at this point. because it was simpler for me. I wasn't feeling traumatized, but my friend is. So
Yes.
when she needs to embrace something different, it is a matter of, okay, well, what are your resources and what are you drawing close to you? Are you resisting talk therapy because you don't want to be vulnerable? Honey, you're already vulnerable.
Mhm.
You've lost something that feels like losing an arm. You are vulnerable. Recognizing that it's okay to admit that you're vulnerable is where you start. Not, oh, I need to just sit through this. I need to push into this deeper. You actually need a different type of support that has layers to it, that has, multiple legs on the table to hold it up, not just four. Maybe
Yeah.
we need six different things to come alongside. But that's the point of my book. And there's not a whole lot about trauma necessarily in the book, but just recognizing that each of our stories are so unique that what worked for me isn't necessarily going to work for everyone. However, if you don't try something new, if you just say, well, that won't work, or it's too hard, I can't touch it, then you'll never know what you don't know. You'll never
Exactly.
know that watching a funny show at night as a secondary narrative lets you fall asleep if you don't try it. And if it doesn't work, okay, it doesn't work. Throw that broken light bulb in the box and try to create a better light bulb.
Yeah.
That's why we call it work. Doing the work is you have to actually try something different that is unexpected, because otherwise you're just repeating yourself.
Yes. Oh, I love all of that. So I just really, I just find your work so, encouraging and just vulnerable
Mm,
and authentic. It's just your authenticity really shows through your work and your words and the way that
mm,
you're, a guide for those of us that are also in something similar. Like you said, each one's so unique, but finding
yeah,
value of those commonalities. And I just think that that's such a
yeah,
beautiful thing. So I just want to thank everybody for tuning in. And Mandy,
yeah.
is there anything you want to leave us with? Any last words or
Mm.
encouragement or hope or advice or anything that you want to share?
Oh, yes. I want to share that one of the things that has helped me the most in my grief is, like I said, being willing to unlearn what I think I know about loss, what I think I know about others, what I think I know about faith. Unlearning has given me more space to recreate something that serves me, that has turned me into the person I'm becoming, and that I owe it to myself and anyone I've lost to honor my process of becoming, because
Yeah.
there's no arrival. So honor your process of becoming, because you will never regret showing up for yourself in that way.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I love it. Yes. And I just want to remind everybody, because I see some questions coming in. Mandy's book is Restorative Grief, and I will put the link directly in the comments so that you can just click and purchase this
Yay.
book. I will put her website in the comments as well. And all of her information will just be one click away. It'll take me a few minutes to get that in there, but as soon as we're done chatting, it'll all be in there. And I just want to thank you so much for coming on
Yeah,
and offering your
gosh.
wisdom and your story with us, because I'm really honored to hear it.
Well, thanks for having me. It's the first time I've ever done this live, so I appreciate your grace for me bubbling
Oh,
through it. And it's so fun to have people responding. So thank you for making time and joining us, everyone.
yes, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. And we will see you later. And thanks for joining in. If you have any other questions that maybe we didn't get to, make sure that you
Yep.
put them in the comment section, and we'll check back. So thank you,
Yep.
everybody, and good night.
Good night.